Hello and welcome back to RivetingTV Part 5, our Tuesday company battles. That's not quite company battles, although there are company battles. In half an hour in Part 6, we will be doing tank company battles with me and hosting it on the stream. So if you're here for Water Tanks, you are not going to be disappointed. If you are here for Omelette, you are also not going to be disappointed because this chapter is freaking epic, man. Oh, freaking yeah. Don't worry, the last company battle of the night will be tier 6. All for fun, just scouts and stuff. So you'll be able to do that one. Right. Omelette, a chicken in peril. Chapter 5. As soon as Omelette saw the two men approaching the farm, he sensed something was wrong. Most visitors spoke loudly and walked straight up to the door. These two, on the other hand, walked silently and looked about them furtively. They carried a long net and large sticks in their hands. Involuntarily, a cry of warning rose to Omelette's throat, but the hens ignored him. "Oh, shut up," they cried. "Don't you know it's bedtime?" "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered and went off to consult Eric. The men drove their van up to the pigsty, blocking off the exit and trapping the sheep who were being kept in the lower pastures. They turned off the headlights of the van and worked with torches in the moonlight. One of them opened the rear doors of the van and lowered the tailgate. First they herded the sheep into the van, and then the pigs. Enoch tried to turn back, but the men shouted and struck him with their clubs. He squealed in terror. Omelette felt afraid. He looked around for Eric. He would know what to do. But Eric was nowhere to be seen. Omelette crouched, squawking in the shelter of a low hedge. He watched in horror as two men rounded up as many of the farm animals as they could lay their hands on. They worked with a quiet frenzy, talking to each other. Only when they had to, and then only in hoarse whispers. After half an hour they stopped. They stood, looking about them. "Here, hadn't we be off, Harry? You scared of the dark or something?" said Harry. "Ain't scared of nothing, Harry. Just thinking about the geezer who lives here. Don't want him coming back and catching us. Snouty, you make me sick, you old yeller." He wiped his hands. "Alright, let's keep moving. We don't want..." He didn't get a chance to finish his sentence. There was a thunder of hooves and suddenly he was struck by a pair of sharp horns and was sent sprawling into the mud. "Eric!" whispered Omelette, his eyes glowing with pride. Only Eric would have the courage to do that. "What the..." shouted Harry. He tried to get to his feet, but Eric was at him again, bowling him over and over again and again. "Get him off me! Get him off me!" the man called Snout threw a net over both figures. They began clubbing at random. "Ouch!" screamed Harry. "Not me! Don't hit me, you stupid Burke! Hit the goat!" Eventually, Harry managed to get clear of the net and they bundled Eric, still bucking and rearing and entangled, into the back of the van. Omelette could restrain himself no longer. He couldn't leave Eric to fight the battle alone. He half ran, half flew across the darkness of the farmyard and threw himself at the man called Snout and scratched with abandoned fury. Snout roared and beat Omelette, who felt himself tumbling across the floor. A dull pain at his side. He shook himself and returned to the fray, but he felt a powerful hand grip him tightly around the throat. "Gotcha!" cried Harry in triumph. Omelette turned his head around this way and that, but could not free himself from the iron grip. He opened his beak for air, but his throat was held too tightly. He felt himself growing faint. The man called Harry leaned his face towards him. On his left cheek, just beneath the eye, was a small tattoo. It showed two knives crossed. "Think you could beat Harry, did ya, you midget?" he sneered. "You wait till Christmas comes and I'll have you special just for myself." Omelette struck his beak at the tattoo. "Ah!" Harry screamed, clutching his hand to his face. He flung the little Bantam into the back of the van with the other animals. The door smashed shut. Then the engine started and they rolled towards the gate. What pandemonium and terror was there within the van? The hens and ducks flew at each other and into the walls of the vehicle in a blind panic as it raced bouncing and lurching down the rutted track. "Why did you come back?" asked Eric above the din. "I couldn't leave you to fight those men on your own," replied Omelette hoarsely. His neck was still sore. "Not very sensible. Now we're both caught," said Eric. He noticed the little Bantam's expression. "But I appreciate the loyalty," he said in a softer tone. "Where do you think they're taking us?" "Can't you smell it?" said Eric. "Smell what?" Omelette lifted his beak to sniff the air. There was a strangish scent. He couldn't quite put a name to it, but it filled him with a strange, nameless fear. "What is it?" "Blood," said Eric. He looked about him and whispered, "I've smelt it before on the other farm. It means they're taking us to the slaughterhouse." "Slaughter!" cried Omelette. "Shh!" hissed Eric. But it was too late. The other creatures had heard the word. It had passed amongst them like wildfire, and the panic increased and became hysteria. What can we do? Asked Omelette. Well, I'd rather die fighting, said Eric. He raised his voice above the screaming and lamentation. Make way there. Give me room. He cleared a corridor down the centre of the van. Away from the door there, he ordered. The animals moved. What are you going to do? Asked Omelette. They will have to stop somewhere, and if I can kick this door open, follow me. Come out fighting, then run for your life. But it was late at night and the roads were empty. The van moved through the gloom for a mile upon mile, never having to stop. The animals stared at one another dismally. Then, at last, the van slowed and finally stopped. The man called Snout climbed down. A small tree had fallen across the lane. I'll shift it, Snout called to his companion. Eric braced himself. Ready, he asked. Omelette nodded his head determinedly. Ready, he said. Eric turned his back to the door. For a second he was silent and still. Then, with a sudden cry, he lifted his back legs and crashed his hooves into the door. One door splintered, but the rest held. What's that? Said Snout. That blasted goat, said Harry. He's got to break the door down. He picked up a shotgun that lay on hooks behind his head. Might as well kill him here instead of waiting for the slaughterhouse. And he laughed softly. He walked round to the rear of the van. Snout followed him. Crash! Eric's hooves struck once more. The door gave, but it was still held by the chain. Help! Murder! Screamed the geese and flew wildly from side to side. Their white feathers filled the van. Eric panted with exhaustion. He had put everything he had into those two wild kicks. His rear leg was bleeding just above the right hoof where he had struck the iron bolt. Through the chink in the iron door they could see two men. The man called Harry pushed the cartridge into his shotgun and locked it. Eric's eyes were closed as he gathered every ounce of his remaining strength, then charged headlong at the chain. With a splintering roar, the door swung open, knocking the two men to the ground. Eric picked himself up. Liberty! He shouted, and his voice echoed off the hills and on the stones. Come on! Omelette scrambled onto Eric's back. Charge! Shouted Omelette. Charge! Shouted Eric and leapt into the night. The two men was just climbing to their feet when the enraged goat with the abandoned cock on his back arched through the air towards them. They had just time to take in the vision before Eric struck them with full force in the powerful horns. They were once more rolling in the grovelling mud. The other animals piled out of the van. Enoch the boar leapt out, landing on Snout's stomach and knocking all the breath out of him. The hens and sheep and ducks and goats followed, filling the roadway. A car came down the road. The driver slammed on his brakes and skidded sideways into the van. Eric was plunged into the hillside towards the safety of the woodlands, with Omelette swaying and bobbing on his back. The bandit heard a shout behind him and looked back to see Harry with a shotgun lifted to his shoulder. You wait, he screamed in fury. If I catch you, killing would be too good for you, or have your guts for catapults. There was a flash of fire followed by a crack. Omelette ducked his head. He felt a rush of wind and a branch just above his head exploded in a puff of smoke before crashing down. And then they were in the forest. The branches of the trees lashed and clutched at them. He pressed himself flat to Eric's back. He could hear his panting breath and the racing of blood through his veins. As Eric swung and dodged between the trees, it took all Omelette's skill and concentration to hang on. He could still hear Harry's voice screaming threats, but it was further off now. And then it was all gone altogether, and there was only the sound of Eric's pounding hooves and the crackling and splintering of the occasional branch. Mile upon mile they ran until they reached the very heart of the forest. Then, when he could run no more, Eric stopped. For a time, he merely stood in the forest clearing with the strength to move. His head hung low, and his side rose and fell convulsively as he gasped for air. Then he lay down, unable to speak. Omelette watched him for a little while. An owl hooted ominously. Somewhere in the darkness he heard a twig crack, then silence. He had the feeling that 100 unseen eyes were watching them, and he shivered. How glad he was there, not on his own. He gazed fondly at Eric, whose eyes were closed now. How lucky am I, thought Omelette, to have someone as strong and fearless as Eric as a friend. If I hadn't been for him, I'd be on my way to the slaughterhouse by now. I might even be dead already. Hanging upside down by a hook. He shivered and wondered what it was like to be dead. The thought was too big for him. He would ask Eric about that later, perhaps tomorrow when he was feeling stronger. Then he thought about all the other animals that were downcast once more. Eric was sleeping easily now. Eric had done his part. Now it was his turn. He peered out into the forest. Around him the creatures of the night began to emerge. Omelette marched slowly around the form of his sleeping friend. He felt much older. He sat down on the ground and peered around him, but no matter how hard he tried to stay alert, his eyelids kept closing. The air became cold. He huddled closer to Eric, who half woke for a second, but turned and rolled over. He mumbled something in his sleep. Omelette wondered what it was, and he laid his ear closer. "Liberty," said Eric softly. "Liberty." His feet started shuffling in his sleep. Despite the pain in his wing and his side, Omelette could not help smiling. "Liberty," he repeated softly, before he too fell asleep. Chapter 5 of Omelette, a Chicken in Peril. Told you that chapter was good, wasn't that good? Who liked that chapter? Come on. Liberty! Oh, freaking yeah. It's good. It's good. It gets better. It gets better. Oh, yeah. Okay. Last chapter of tonight. And then we'll get into some World of Tanks action. Oh, hell freaking yeah. Chapter 6 of Omelette, a Chicken in Peril. By Gareth Owen. The sun was already high in the sky when Omelette awoke. It wasn't like him to sleep late. He looked about him. Where could he be? Where was the farmhouse with all its familiar sounds? The snort of the pigs, the querulous hens and the cackling ducks, and the sunlight was thinner as it filtered through the trees. Where was he? Then slowly the terrible events of the previous day came creeping back into his mind. Had all that really happened? Surely it had been just a dream. Then he noticed the trail of blood on the forest floor. No, it hadn't been a dream. He shivered in fear. Eric? Eric! Where was Eric? He searched about him. The forest glade was empty, yet he had a feeling that someone was watching him. Someone out there in the shadows, the trees. He sensed a pair of eyes. He glared around him with the fiercest expression, but his heart was thumping with fear. The air was sharp around him, bitter stench that he had never smelled before, and yet it seemed to carry a message to him, and the message was enemy. He was just about to cry out in fear and alarm when something touched him on the shoulder. Ah! I wouldn't do that if I was you, a voice said on his shoulder. Omelette gasped and looked around. It was Eric, and breathed a sigh of relief. Wouldn't do that just now, repeated Eric. We don't know who or what's out there. The fewer that know we're here, the better. Those men might be still about. We don't want them to know where we are. Omelette nodded. For the first time he acknowledged how fortunate he was to have such a wise, experienced friend as Eric to accompany him. It was just as I smelled something. There was something out there. Probably a fox. Wouldn't bother me, of course, but he'll snap your head off as soon as he looked at you. Omelette gulped and moved over to his companion. Don't worry, said Eric. He won't bother you with me around. Come on. He set off through the forest with Omelette trotting behind. Where are we going? He asked. What shall we do? First thing is get out of this forest. If I can find a few landmarks, the river for example, we might know where we are. Then we can decide what's best to do. Couldn't we go back to the farmhouse, Omelette? Eric pushed his way through some thick undergrowth. That's what we have to do if we can ever find it, he replied. He stopped and looked at Omelette. The little badger had his back legs caught in some brambles. He tugged. The brambles suddenly released him and he fell flat on his face. He climbed to his feet. There was mud flat on his face. There was mud on his feathers and in his eyes, and his wing hurt. Will we be home soon, Eric? I don't know. How far is it, Eric? I don't know. How long would it take, Eric? How the hell should I know? Eric, I'm hungry. When can we eat? Eric stopped. Look, stop asking so many questions. What we must do is just keep going. Get out of this forest, then we'll see. Omelette looked up at his friend. Am I being a nuisance, Eric? Don't talk too much. Try to think a bit before you speak. Eric was walking quickly. Omelette ran alongside him, trying to keep pace and gazing up. Think, he said. There was mud in his eyes. It was difficult to see. He tripped over a low branch again. Yes, think, said Eric. He waited for Omelette to catch up, and then when you've thought about something sensible, say it, but not until then. And Eric marched onwards at an even swifter pace, whistling a military tune. This was obviously the thing to do when hiking adventurously through a forest. Omelette joined in at the whistling as best he could. He tried to keep step, but his little legs were hard to move at 3 times the pace of Eric's. It was hard to run and whistle at the same time. If you go to whistle, then kindly try to keep in tune, said Eric without looking at him, or else sing your own tune. Omelette didn't really know the tunes. He looked about him for inspiration. Eric suddenly stopped. He stared at something on the ground. Omelette joined him. Look, said Eric. Omelette looked. All he could see was a soft patch of mud with some marks scratched into it. What is it? He began. Think, said Eric sharply. Omelette put on a thinking expression, but it didn't help. What do you see? Asked Eric patiently. Mud. What else? Marks. What marks? Omelette looked closer. He had a flash of inspiration. Claw marks. Whose? Hens? Omelette smiled. His thinking hadn't been in vain. Then he just had another thought. That means Hen must have been here. He felt proud at his detective work. Put your foot in them, said Eric. Carefully, Omelette placed his claw on the marks. They matched perfectly. The hen must be the same size as me, he said. What a coincidence. Eric sighed. Of course they're the same size. Eric sighed again. Look around. Recognize that tree, that bush? They are your footprints. We're back where we started. We've gone round in a bloody circle. Omelette felt a great gloom descending on him. Round in a circle? Perhaps they would never get home. Everywhere in the forest looked the same as everywhere else. What if they never found their way out? Suddenly he began to feel hungry and bad-tempered. I hate this forest, he thought. How hate this dark. Fed up. I want to die. I want to die now. He stamped his feet in a tantrum. Eric looked at him. You want to die, huh? He said. Fine. He looked about him. Well, this looks as good a place as any. First-rate place for dying, I should say. Happy dying. Goodbye. And he strode away, whistling in the gloom. Omelette ran after him. Eric, where are you going? You can't leave me, he screamed. Eric looked back at the little bandit. But I thought you wanted to give up and die, so I thought I'd better let you get on with it. Chin chin, and began to walk off. But Omelette caught up with him. But what about me? Don't leave me, Eric. Please take me with you, please. Eric looked him straight in the eye. If you want to come with me, there are certain conditions. You mustn't grumble or sulk or talk about dying. Do you understand? Omelette nodded. I understand. It's a hat. My son again. You must be cheerful in the face of danger, and when the hour seems darkest, then that's when you need to be optimistic. Optimistic, said Omelette? Right, fine. Very well, but remember this. At the first sign of grumble or a sulk from you, I shall walk away and leave you. I won't grumble, honest. He crossed his heart enthusiastically. Well, we'll see, said Eric. He looked up at the trees. Now, what we must do is walk so that we don't go into a circle. He began to mumble to himself and walk up and down. Omelette kept silent, for he knew that Eric was thinking. Notice the trees, he said suddenly. Nearly all of them leaned the same way. Omelette looked up. It was true. All the trees did lean one way. If we always walk so the trees lean away from us, we're bound to come out of the forest sometime. Omelette looked at Eric in amazement. He remembered the promise he had made about always being cheerful and optimistic, and he would try it. A huge grin split on his face. Oh, I should think so, Eric. And we'll be out in no time. Nothing to it. Come on then, said Eric. Once more, the two lost creatures began to trek. Once more, the two lost creatures began to trek through the darkness of the forest. They walked for hours, always following the leaning pattern of the trees. Omelette was feeling really very tired, but he remembered his promise. Every now and again he would catch up with Eric in order to demonstrate how careful he was being. I think we're doing awfully well. This must be the right way, he would chirp cheerfully. Or I'm feeling very cheerful. I'm lost in this darkness, dangerous forest, aren't you, Eric? Or I'm sure we'll be out and home soon. I'm in a tremendous optimistic frame of mind. After 3 hours of this, Eric stopped and looked at him. It's possible to overdo the cheerfulness, you know, he said. Omelette looked crestfallen. I was only doing what you told me. I understand that, said Eric, but can we just walk in silence? Silence? For a bit. Omelette nodded, and for an hour he followed Eric in silence. Whenever Eric looked at him, he smiled and nodded, but despite his cheerful exterior, he was feeling quite miserable. They seemed to have been walking for hours and hours. He wondered if there was an end to the forest. Perhaps it went on forever. Then suddenly Eric stopped in his tracks. Listen, he said. Omelette cocked his head. He heard a distant roaring. What could it be? They advanced a few places. There it was again, only louder. Was it a wild creature of the wood? A monster? Omelette began to back away, but Eric pulled him forward. We must go on. Must we? Said Omelette, without conviction. The alternative is to return to the forest. We must face this new danger altogether. Are you with me? Omelette looked behind him. Suddenly the forest didn't look like a bad place. I'm with you, he said. Try as he might, he couldn't quite keep the quiver out of his voice. Come on then, let's keep together. That was an unnecessary piece of advice. The two friends advanced towards the enemy side by side, and the closer they got, the louder the awful roaring sound became.